On the afternoon of February 24, 1986, in Van Nuys, Los Angeles, John Ruetten returned home from work, climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, pushed open a door that was already slightly ajar, and was met with a sight that would shatter his world. His newlywed wife was lying on the living room floor in a pool of blood. They had been married for exactly 3 months. Sherri's wedding ring was still on her finger. For the next 23 years, the woman who had killed Sherri Rasmussen continued to put on a police uniform every morning, showed up for work, advanced through the ranks of her career, and operated out of the same building as the investigators working the very murder she had committed. The Los Angeles Police Department concluded on the very first night that it had been a burglary gone wrong, an intruder who had encountered the homeowner and killed her to avoid being identified. Nobody challenged that conclusion for 2 full decades. All the while, Sherri's father, Nuys Rasmussen, had known the name of his daughter's killer since 1986. He gave that name to the police. He pleaded with them to investigate it. He wrote letters. He requested in-person meetings. He never stopped pushing. And they told him he had been watching too much television. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, the middle of 3 sisters. She was so intellectually gifted that she skipped 2 grades and began college at the age of 16. Her father had initially hoped she would pursue medicine, but Sherri chose nursing because she believed it would allow her to build both a fulfilling career and a family life. By 23 she held a master's degree and was teaching at UCLA. By her late 20s she had become the nursing director at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, the youngest woman ever appointed to that position at the hospital, while simultaneously maintaining an unpaid clinical professorship at UCLA where she continued to train nurses. Those who worked with Sherri remembered her not only for her skill and competence but for the way she carried herself with people. She listened. She remembered everyone's name. She was the person you would want at your side during the worst hours of your life. Her sister Teresa Lane described her as everything to the family, the big sister, the best friend, the one who was always lifting others up and who radiated a quiet, steady confidence. In June 1984, Sherri met John Ruetten at a party. He was a computer engineer who later described being drawn to her smile and laugh from the moment he first noticed her across the room. They dated and married in November 1985. But John Ruetten brought something into that marriage he had never fully disclosed to Sherri, another woman who remained obsessed with him, who continued inserting herself into his life, and who refused to accept that he had chosen someone else. What makes this case particularly haunting is that Sherri knew she was in danger. She had confronted the person threatening her directly. She had spoken openly about it to her father in the weeks leading up to her death. And nobody listened. The morning of February 24, 1986 started like any other. Sherri stayed home that day and did not go into work. Ruetten left the apartment at 7:20 in the morning, seeing his wife for the last time as she lay in bed. He forgot to arm the security system and was never entirely certain whether he had locked the door behind him, a detail he would carry with him for the rest of his life. A neighbor observed that the apartment's garage door was still closed at 8:30 in the morning. By 9:30, the garage was open and Sherri's new BMW was gone. Investigators would later establish that the murder had taken place sometime between 8:30 and 10 in the morning, while the neighborhood was quiet and nobody had noticed anything unusual. That afternoon, Ruetten finished work and drove home. He saw the garage standing open. Sherri's car was missing. Unusual, but Sherri was a nursing director and emergencies arose without warning. He climbed the stairs. The front door was slightly open. He pushed it and stepped inside. His wife was lying on the living room floor in a pool of blood. He called 911 immediately. Detective Lyle Meyer arrived at the scene on the night of February 24, 1986. Within minutes of looking around the apartment, he formed a conclusion that would shape the entire direction of the investigation for the next 23 years. He observed electronic equipment stacked near the front door, noted that Sherri's wallet and car had been taken, and told Ruetten in their very first conversation that he believed the apartment had been burglarized that morning before 10 o'clock, and that the intruder had entered by forcing open the front door. But when other investigators examined the front door more closely, they found no evidence of forced entry whatsoever. The door had simply been unlocked, or opened from the inside, or Sherri had let the person in herself. That finding did not alter the direction of the investigation. One of the first responders who entered the apartment recalled what she saw, Sherri Rasmussen on the floor, covered with a blanket. One of the medical personnel lifted it to show her face. The trauma was severe and immediately identifiable as a homicide. The crime scene those investigators were standing in told a far more complicated story than a straightforward burglary. Sherri Rasmussen did not die quickly or without a fight. She had been savagely beaten about the head with multiple objects. A vase in the living room lay shattered. A gun handle had been used to strike her face at least twice. The right side of her face was swollen and badly bruised, her eyes blackened, her glasses broken and scattered across the floor. Deep scratch marks had been left on the front door, the final, desperate evidence of someone trying to escape. She had been shot 3 times in the chest with a .38 caliber weapon. The attacker had pressed a pillow against the barrel to muffle the sound of the gunshots so that no one nearby would hear them. On Sherri's left arm was a deep bite wound, evidence of a direct and close physical struggle, the kind that does not come from a panicked burglar stumbling upon a homeowner, but from someone fighting over a weapon in close quarters. 2 of her fingernails had been broken. She had been restrained. A forensic technician collected a sample from the bite mark and placed it in storage. Standard procedure. Nobody in that apartment that night gave it a second thought. A collection of video and audio equipment had been neatly arranged in a stack near the front door, not scattered or overturned the way belongings typically look after a genuine break-in, but carefully placed there, as though someone had set it down deliberately after everything else was over. Sherri's wallet and her new BMW had been taken. The couple's marriage certificate was missing. But not a single piece of jewelry had been touched. This was a detail no opportunistic burglar would ever leave behind. Diamond rings and gold chains carried far more street value than a piece of paper. Nobody questioned the inconsistency. One of the first responders also took note of John Ruetten. She later recalled seeing him seated at the dining table near the door, appearing to cry, but said his emotional response did not seem proportionate to the fact that his wife was lying dead on the floor just feet away. Detective Meyer went so far as to tell Ruetten directly that he considered himself a good judge of character and was fairly confident the husband had nothing to do with it, effectively ruling out the most significant person in the immediate circle based on nothing more than a first impression. Another investigator at the scene raised a concern that went nowhere. Burglars, he noted, typically do not target houses in the middle of a block because they want a clear escape route. They choose properties closer to the street. The fact that this apartment had been selected struck him as strange. That observation was not enough to shift anything. Ruetten's whereabouts were independently verified by co-workers. He had been at his office throughout the day and was cleared. When news of Sherri's death reached the Rasmussen family, it did not come from John, it came from a friend of John's father. When Nuys Rasmussen asked to speak with his son-in-law, he was told that John did not want to talk. When the family went to the police station, Ruetten continued to refuse contact with them, claiming that investigators had instructed him not to speak with them. Nuys found his attitude deeply unsettling. He seemed, Nuys said, more focused on himself than on Sherri. At the funeral, Ruetten spoke publicly about his wife for the last time, then departed Los Angeles and never came back. Meanwhile, Nuys began sharing with police everything Sherri had confided in him during the weeks before her death. Stephanie Lazarus, an lapped officer, Ruetten's former girlfriend, the woman who had repeatedly harassed Sherri, the woman Sherri had been frightened of. Detective Meyer heard Nuys out and dismissed everything he said. There was nothing there, he told him. Then, bluntly, "You're watching too much television." That phrase lodged itself in the Rasmussen family's memory and stayed there for the next 23 years. 5 weeks after Sherri's murder, 2 men broke into another home in the same neighborhood, less than a mile away. The homeowner returned and surprised them inside. One of the men produced a gun before both fled. Witnesses described 2 Hispanic men in their early 20s, one of them armed. A sketch was made and distributed across the city. Police immediately connected this incident to Sherri's killing. Same neighborhood, same general time frame, same type of weapon. The burglary theory gained what appeared to be solid additional support. Neither man was ever caught. And the burglary theory endured for another 23 years on the strength of those 2 unidentified individuals. Sherri's BMW was recovered 11 days later, parked on a street 3.2 kilometers from the apartment, wiped clean of fingerprints. Her wallet was found as well, also free of prints. Then complete silence. The Rasmussen family refused to let the case go quiet. A year after the murder they held a press conference, reissued the reward offer, and publicly called for more action. Nuys wrote directly to Police Chief Daryl Gates raising the possibility that Lazarus was involved. In 1988, Sherri's sister proposed that renowned true crime author and Rule write a book about the case. Rule expressed interest and asked a retired lap detective to make some informal inquiries about the Lazarus angle. A few days later, Rule called back and reported that the person she had spoken with told her the case was too sensitive to touch. Rule did not write the book. Lazarus continued walking into lap headquarters every morning, moving through the same hallways where a murder file bearing Sherri Rasmussen's name sat quietly in storage. Detective Meyer retired in 1991. The Rasmussen file was transferred to a new investigator who met with the family and told them plainly that he could not make sense of Meyer's notes and did not expect any new leads to surface. Nels Rasmussen had flown in from Tucson to Los Angeles to hear that. He would make that journey many more times in the years that followed. Every time the file changed hands, the family would fly in again, sit in the same interview room, face a new detective holding the same file, and return to Tucson with broken hearts. Each meeting felt less like a genuine investigation and more like an obligation being performed. In 1993, Nels read about advances in DNA testing and immediately recognized its potential. He offered to cover the cost of testing the evidence in storage himself. No department budget required, no complicated requests, just permission to test what was already sitting in the archives. He was turned down. He was told that the department needed to have a suspect identified before testing could be authorized. He had been pointing to a suspect since 1986. Nobody would listen. Then came what may be the strangest development across all 23 years of the case. A significant portion of the evidence connected to the investigation disappeared from the file. The official explanation given was that the murder file had grown too large for the cold case office storage, and so half of it had been removed to free up space. The Rasmussen family could find no satisfactory answer to what had happened to those documents. In 1997, a small fragment of light appeared. A former colleague of Sherri's secretary at the hospital contacted police and described an incident from January 1986, just weeks before Sherri's murder, in which Lazarus had come to Sherri's hospital office to confront her directly. The secretary had told this colleague about the confrontation immediately after it happened. This was direct eyewitness testimony to Lazarus's threatening behavior in the period leading up to the killing. No meaningful follow-up was ever conducted. 3 years later, the secretary died, and her first-hand account died with her. While the Rasmussen family was fighting to keep the case from being forgotten, Stephanie Lazarus was building a career inside the lab. During the 1990s she worked in the personnel division, the unit that handled personal records on both officers and suspects, a position that gave her direct visibility into whose names were under active investigation and whose were not. A colleague in that department later recalled that Lazarus had once mentioned, casually and in passing during an ordinary office conversation, that she had been interviewed as part of a murder investigation involving the missing wife of a former boyfriend who had possibly been shot. She brought it up the way someone might mention an unremarkable event from their week. Nobody found it worth noting. Lazarus went on to make detective, appeared in news coverage, and was referenced in books about the underground art world. Prosecutors would later describe her as an average cop, not exceptional, not incompetent, not someone who stood out in any particular way, good enough to exist without attracting attention for 23 years. Her office was down the hall from the detectives working the Rasmussen case. Same hallway. Same building. Same organization. And as a law enforcement officer, she had direct insight into exactly where the investigation stood at any given point, what evidence was being examined, and whether her name had appeared on any list of interest. 2 weeks after killing Sherri, she reported her .38 caliber backup weapon missing to Santa Monica police, but failed to report the loss to the lab, as all officers in the department were required to do. 1 month after that, she reported to lab that she had purchased a replacement firearm. Those two events, losing a gun without reporting it to the correct agency, then immediately buying a new one, sat in 2 separate files held by 2 different agencies. Nobody connected them for 23 years. In 2001, the lab established a cold case unit to address a backlog of more than 9,000 unsolved murders stretching across more than 2 decades. The Rasmussen file, now 15 years old, did not land with a detective who had the time or resources to give it proper attention. Instead it was assigned to a criminalist named Jennifer Francis, not a detective, not an investigator, but a crime scene analyst. Francis began working through the evidence boxes herself, reading through every page of the file, and gradually identified what 4 previous detectives had failed to see. She found detailed notes referencing the bite mark on Sherri's left arm, the deep wound that had been swabbed on the very first night at the scene. But something about the file did not add up. It stated that investigators had obtained only a single blood type from that bite. Francis recognized immediately that this was scientifically wrong. A bite mark should yield 2 separate DNA profiles, one from the victim and one from the person who inflicted the bite. The file implied that Sherri had bitten herself, a conclusion Francis found completely implausible on both biological and practical grounds. So where was the swab? Francis checked the evidence locker. It was not there. She began calling every forensic laboratory in the city, one by one, describing what she was looking for. Nobody had it. Then, after 6 hours of calls and waiting, a coroner at the Los Angeles County morgue said he had found something. A torn envelope with a label so faded it was barely legible, sitting in a freezer since 1986. Inside the damaged envelope was a small intact glass vial containing the swab. 15 years in a freezer, deteriorated packaging, faded identification, but the sample itself was still viable. Francis sent it for testing immediately. The result came back. The DNA belonged to a female. Not Sherri. Another woman entirely, the person who had bitten Sherri Rasmussen during the struggle on February 24, 1986. Francis also read carefully through the documentation of Nuys Rasmussen's years of efforts. The letters, the meetings, the name Lazarus appearing again and again, dismissed again and again, and a theory began to take shape. The woman who had stalked Sherri and the ex-girlfriend of Ruetten were the same person. That person had bitten Sherri in the course of a physical struggle and killed her. Francis brought her findings to the cold case unit. She was ignored. She escalated to the scientific division. Ignored again. She pushed it to robbery homicide. Ignored again. She took it to internal affairs. This time she was not ignored, she was met with something worse. Everywhere she went, the response of her superiors was not to examine the evidence but to examine her. Her mental state was questioned. She was called too emotional, paranoid, obsessed with the Rasmussen case. She was required to attend mandatory counseling sessions with a therapist appointed by the LAPT, a decision that internally marked her as potentially unstable and unsuited for major case work. But what unsettled Francis most was not the mandatory counseling itself. It was what happened inside those sessions. The therapist did not ask about her mental health. They asked who she had spoken to about the case. They asked what information she had shared with anyone outside the department. Francis understood then that this was not therapy. It was an interrogation. A deputy district attorney called her unstable. Colleagues in the laboratory treated her as a nuisance, suggesting she find another hobby. She was removed from significant casework and reassigned to low-priority tasks in a corner of the department. Jennifer Francis was walking the exact same road that Nuys Rasmussen had walked for 15 years before her, the only person who could see what was true, being methodically crushed by the very system that was supposed to be pursuing the truth. That same year, Detective Cliff Shepard independently noticed the bite mark notation in the file and requested further testing on his own initiative. Shepard's results confirmed everything Francis had found. The DNA was female. That's not what I expected, Shepard said. The discovery dismantled the 15-year-old theory of two male burglars in a single result. The overwhelming majority of residential break-in offenders are male, and biting an opponent during a physical confrontation was not the behavior of a panicked intruder looking for an exit. It was the behavior of someone locked in direct, face-to-face combat with Sherri Rasmussen. The question was no longer who had broken into Sherri's home. The question was which woman had killed her. Lazarus had met Ruetten at UCLA in the late 1970s when both were undergraduates. To Ruetten, it had been a casual and uncommitted arrangement. He dated other people throughout the same period and never regarded Lazarus as a serious girlfriend. To Lazarus, it was the most significant relationship of her life. That fundamental asymmetry, two people looking at the same relationship and seeing two entirely different things, was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. And Lazarus's level of fixation on Ruetten was not something that had emerged in 1985 or 1986. It had already made itself apparent while they were still in college. Ruetten later disclosed to investigators that while living in the UCLA dormitories, Lazarus had stolen his underwear and had crept into his room to photograph him while he slept. He was aware of it, and he continued the relationship regardless, continued having a sexual relationship with her even after becoming engaged to Sherri, because he did not want to cause her pain. In doing so, he kept adding fuel to a fire he refused to acknowledge was already burning out of control. In August 1985, as the reality of the upcoming marriage became undeniable, Lazarus wrote to her mother expressing that she truly loved John, that the past year had torn her apart, and that she would never fully understand the decision he had made. But acknowledging it in a letter was as far as acceptance went. Between June and August 1985, Lazarus began showing up at the hospital where Sherri worked during regular business hours, dressed in a way that seemed deliberately provocative, as though she was making a statement. She went directly to Sherri's office and told Ruetten's new wife to her face that she and John were still sleeping together, and that when the marriage fell apart, she would be there to collect the pieces. Sherri responded with equal directness, her services would not be needed. Lazarus departed with a final remark that left no room for interpretation. If she could not have John, nobody else would either. Not even Sherri. Then she began appearing at Sherri and Ruetten's home. One morning after Ruetten had left for work, Sherri opened the door to find Lazarus standing inside their living room wearing her lapped uniform. Sherri told her to leave. She did, but it did not end there. Sherri began being followed. At least 5 times in a single week, the same person appeared at the store she visited, the gym she used, the route she routinely traveled. Sherri described the person stalking her to her father as someone whose eyes seemed to look straight through you. In early February 1986, 3 weeks before she was killed, Sherri traveled to Tucson to see her father and told him she was frightened, that she believed Lazarus was following her on the streets, sometimes disguising herself to look like a young man. Sherri never disclosed the stalker's identity to police, something the Rasmussen family would later acknowledge with deep regret. On February 14, 1986, Valentine's Day, Lazarus's roommate moved out. She was living alone. 1 week later, on February 23, a friend of Ruetten's from Ukla came to visit the apartment. The following day, Sherri Rasmussen was dead. In November 2009, Detective James Nuttall from Robbery Homicide reached out to Jennifer Francis. Francis had waited more than 5 years for someone from the department to come to her. But she was cautious, because everything she had experienced in those years had taught her one lesson with painful clarity. Not everyone inside the lab actually wanted the truth to come out. She told Nuttall that she did not believe the murder had been a burglary and that she had reason to think evidence may have been interfered with. But she stopped short of sharing her full theory, did not name Lazarus, and did not go further than what she felt confident Nuttall already knew. Nuttall already had the DNA results in front of him and had drawn his own conclusions. He had read through dozens of letters from Nels Rasmussen over the years, had seen Lazarus's name appearing repeatedly and being dismissed repeatedly, and had gone back to the original 1986 interview with John Ruetten to find that Detective Meyer had arrived at his conclusions too quickly. He also recognized something that made the previous 23 years even harder to explain. Not one of the 3 detectives who had subsequently reopened the case had ever conducted a second interview with John, the one person who held the complete picture of Lazarus and everything that had happened. Nuttall made a decision. He would build a secret investigative circle inside the department, consisting only of himself, Francis, and 3 other detectives he trusted without reservation. The objective was to prove that one of their own colleagues had murdered Sherri Rasmussen. The first step was to locate John Ruetten, who had long since moved to the Bay Area, remarried, and started a family. Nuttall arranged an interview and from the outset took an approach entirely different from anything that had come before. Direct, unafraid to ask hard questions about the ex-girlfriend, unwilling to step around the uncomfortable details. Ruetten did not just provide Lazarus's name. He described every confrontation in full, the visits to the hospital, the morning he came home to find Lazarus standing in their living room in her police uniform, information that had never made it into the case file across 23 years. And Ruetten admitted something he had never stated directly before. While engaged to Sherri, he had continued sleeping with Lazarus. He knew she was obsessed with him. He had refused to make a clean break anyway. The Rasmussen family later said plainly that he had not been honest with Sherri, that instead of addressing the situation directly he had let it drag on, and that he had not behaved like a man who truly loved his wife. Nuttall now had a name. He had a motive. He had the full history. But investigating an active duty police officer presented complications that no ordinary homicide case ever would. He could not request a DNA sample from Lazarus without solid legal justification. She had every right to refuse, and the request itself would immediately expose the investigation. He could not question her directly because she would recognize what was happening and could alert colleagues, eliminate evidence, or disappear. And Lazarus's office was right down the hall from the detectives now investigating her. Any shift in the behavior of those around her could be picked up immediately. Nuttall's solution was a covert surveillance unit that operated entirely off the department's regular record system, leaving no trace that could be discovered internally. The team followed Lazarus for weeks, at work, on her route home, throughout her daily routine. Then, at a store, Lazarus purchased a drink, finished it, and threw the plastic cup in a trash can on her way out. The surveillance team retrieved it the moment she was gone. DNA extracted from the saliva on the rim of the cup was sent immediately to Francis, who compared it against the swab taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm, the sample that had been sitting in a freezer since 1986, the one she had spent 6 hours tracking down. It was a perfect match. The person who had bitten Sherri Rasmussen during the struggle on February 24, 1986 was Stephanie Lazarus. On June 5, 2009, Nuttall arranged for Lazarus to be brought into the suspect interview room, the only space in the entire lab building where nobody was permitted to carry a weapon, under the pretense that they needed her assistance interviewing a difficult subject. Lazarus walked in completely unsuspecting. Once inside the interview room, she initially claimed she had no memory of ever meeting Sherri Rasmussen. When pressed further, her account began to shift. She said she may have spoken to Sherri once or twice, then caught herself as it became apparent she was the subject of the investigation. She demanded to know if she was being accused. She called it ridiculous. She asked for a lawyer and got to her feet. As she walked out of the interview room, she was arrested on the spot. The news moved through the department instantly. Colleagues who had worked alongside Lazarus for 23 years stood in the hallway struggling to process what they were hearing. The trial opened in February 2012 at Los Angeles County Superior Court, 26 years after the night John Ruetten had called 911 from the apartment in Van Nuys. It became one of the most closely watched trials in Lapt history, not only because of the savagery of the murder, but because the defendant standing in that courtroom was someone who had worn the uniform of the very organization now prosecuting her. Lazarus entered a plea of not guilty and did not take the witness stand. She sat without visible emotion throughout the 3 weeks of proceedings, her expression revealing nothing. Prosecutor Shannon Presby opened with a single sentence that distilled the entire case into its essence. 1 bite, 1 bullet, 1 gun barrel, and 1 broken heart. Nuttall's investigation had taken 4 months. The trial took 3 weeks. The jury reached its verdict in less than a day. The evidence presented to the jury had been constructed in layers, each one powerful on its own and devastating in combination, leaving no opening through which any defense argument could pass. The first layer was the DNA from the bite wound on Sherri's left arm, the sample that had spent 15 years in a freezer, the sample Jennifer Francis had devoted 6 hours to tracking down, the sample that matched perfectly with the DNA extracted from the plastic cup Lazarus had thrown in a trash can outside a store. There was no disputing it. The second layer was Lazarus's .38 caliber backup firearm, which matched the type of bullets recovered from the crime scene. She had reported the weapon missing to Santa Monica police 2 weeks after the murder, not to the Lapt, as every officer in the department was required to do, and had then purchased a replacement gun 1 month later and reported that purchase to the Lapt. Those 2 events had existed in 2 separate files held by 2 different agencies for 23 years. Now they were placed side by side in front of a jury. The third layer was Lazarus's personal journals, handwritten pages documenting the depth of her obsession with a man who had never regarded her as his girlfriend, written in her own hand, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The fourth layer was Ruetten's testimony from the witness stand, in which he recounted every confrontation Sherri had described to him, including Lazarus's words at the hospital, "If she could not have John, nobody would." Ruetten broke down multiple times while testifying. When asked how he felt about everything, he said that the knowledge that Sherri's death had come about because she met and married him brought him to his knees. The fifth layer was the crime scene itself, re-examined after 26 years. The front door had not been forced open, despite Detective Meyer's conclusion to the contrary in 1986. The electronic equipment had been neatly stacked, not scattered in the frantic manner of a panicked intruder. The marriage certificate was gone, but not a single piece of jewelry had been touched. No genuine burglar would leave diamond rings untouched. Jennifer Francis then took the witness stand to present the DNA findings and to describe what had happened to her when she attempted to bring those findings to the people responsible for acting on them, being called unstable, being sent to mandatory psychological counseling, being told by colleagues to find another interest. Nuys Rasmussen, the father who had written to the chief of police, who had been told he was watching too much television, who had made the flight from Tucson to Los Angeles more times than he could count, also took the stand and delivered the warning he had been trying to give from the very first day. Defense attorney Mark Overland fought on every front available to him. He leaned heavily on the original burglary theory and pointed to the similar break-in that had occurred nearby as evidence that the 1986 investigators had not been entirely without basis for their conclusion. He challenged the DNA evidence from the bite mark by arguing that the storage envelope had a small puncture, that the preservation conditions had not met proper standards, and that in theory Lazarus's DNA could have been introduced at a later point. He contended that the .38 caliber weapon could not definitively be linked to Lazarus because that caliber was the most commonly carried firearm among Lapt officers at the time. None of it was enough. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life, to be served at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She was permitted to retire from the Lapt following her arrest and continued to collect her police pension while incarcerated, a detail the Rasmussen family never fully came to terms with. Nuys and Loretta Rasmussen both lived long enough to hear the sentence pronounced. They passed away without ever receiving a satisfactory answer to the question they had carried for the rest of their lives. Why had it taken 23 years? Sherri's sister said after the verdict that it felt like a gentle wave of relief when it was finally over. Relief for her father that he had at last received answers. John Ruetten appeared at the 2012 trial, sat on the witness stand, and broke down multiple times beneath the weight of things he had known for a long time but had lacked the courage to confront directly. He acknowledged that continuing to sleep with Lazarus after becoming engaged to Sherri had been a mistake, a word entirely inadequate for consequences of that magnitude. At a parole hearing in 2024, Ruetten stood before the board and stated that Lazarus had maintained her lies for decades until pursuing parole became her only remaining option. He said that Sherri's parents had lost their daughter because Sherri had loved and married him, and that the pain of that knowledge had never diminished. Nuys Rasmussen lived to see Lazarus in handcuffs and lived to hear the sentence read in 2012, but he died without ever receiving a genuine answer to the question he had carried for 23 years, why the police had not listened to him from the beginning, why Lazarus's name had been recorded and never pursued, why a father who knew the truth had been required to wait a quarter of a century before anyone believed him. Before he died, Nuys recorded a video statement to be presented at any future parole hearings. Looking directly into the camera, he said that when you looked at the damage inflicted on his daughter's face, it was clear the attacker had wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherri radiated. That statement was played at the 2023 parole hearing, the voice of a man already gone, still present in the courtroom, still standing guard over his daughter, and it would be presented again at every future hearing at which Lazarus sought release. Sherri's legacy does not live only in legal proceedings and parole hearings. It lives in the people who carry her with them every day without needing to say it aloud. Sherri's niece chose to go into nursing because of the aunt she never had the chance to meet. Her mother had told her about the time she and Sherri studied nursing together, about how Sherri had been drawn to the most complex cardiovascular cases. The youngest granddaughter in the family wore Sherri's wedding dress on her own wedding day, carrying a piece of a woman she had never known into the most significant moment of her life. Lazarus continued fighting from behind bars. In 2023, for the first time since her arrest in 2009, she admitted to killing Sherri, not out of genuine remorse, but because acknowledgement had become a prerequisite for any realistic chance at parole. The confession came 37 years after the murder. She stated that she was sick to think that she had sworn to protect and serve the public and had taken Sherri Rasmussen's life. In November 2023, the parole board initially voted to release her, a decision that was reversed following a forceful response from the Rasmussen family, from Ruetten, and from the public. In February 2025, a new hearing ended in denial. Commissioner Kevin Chappell stated plainly that Lazarus's account of the 1986 attack did not align with the evidence, and that she alone had carried out that extreme act of violence. As of 2026, Stephanie Lazarus, now in her 60s, remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, while the Rasmussen family continues to live with the reality that Sherri's killer receives an lapped pension in prison, and while the questions surrounding those lost 23 years remain without a fully satisfying answer. The Sherri Rasmussen case is taught in American criminal investigation training programs, not because of the DNA evidence, and not because the killer turned out to be a police officer, but because of something more fundamental and far more dangerous. A detective formed a conclusion within the first few minutes of arriving at the scene, and for 23 years the entire investigative apparatus that followed served that conclusion rather than questioning it. When Maya decided on the night of February 24, 1986 that this had been a burglary, every lead, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement that came afterward was filtered through that assumption. When Nuys Rasmussen named Lazarus, he was told there was nothing there. When he offered in 1993 to personally fund DNA testing, he was told a suspect was needed first. The correct answer had been available since 1986, offered by two people, the father and the husband, and nobody was willing to look at it. The second lesson is quieter but no less significant. A forensic technician on the night of February 24, 1986 collected a sample from the bite mark on Sherri's arm and placed it in the freezer. It was a routine action. Nobody in that apartment that night had any idea what it would ultimately mean. But that swab was the sole reason the case was ever solved. Had it been discarded, had that envelope not been preserved, had that freezer not still been holding it when Jennifer Francis spent 6 hours making phone calls looking for it, Stephanie Lazarus would never have been identified. Routine preservation of biological evidence, carried out without drama or foresight, became the only thread that justice ever had to hold on to. The question the Rasmussen family never received a satisfactory answer to remains open. Why did the lab not investigate Lazarus in 1986, when both Nuys Rasmussen and John Ruetten had provided her name, when she was a serving officer within the department, and when every available indicator pointed in her direction? There is no documented evidence of an organized cover-up. But there is also no explanation that adequately accounts for that indifference. The Rasmussen family pursued a lawsuit against the Lapt. It was dismissed on statute of limitations grounds. And Lazarus continues to receive her Lapt pension in prison to this day. If Sherri Rasmussen's story moved you, please subscribe so you do not miss the cases still to come. Every name in those files deserves to be told and remembered. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We will see you in the next one.